Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back into the studio. Today we are going to take a look at repairing seam lines on a resin casting of my sculpture Empyrean. We all wish that our casts come out of the mold perfectly, and maybe they do for some of you, but for me, it never seems to happen. There are always repairs to be done, and it requires a skilled hand in order to eliminate any visible trail of the casting process in the finished piece that will eventually go out to your client. The tools we'll be using today are pretty simple. I've gone ahead and sanded down parts of this seam already with a Dremel tool, and I'll show you how to do that really soon. Often enough, the seam starts out as a positive, kind of like a wall sticking out. This is called flashing, and if it's thin enough, you can break it off with your fingers. No matter how you get rid of it, you still need to sand down the leftover seam in order to build up the texture of the sculpture again. I prefer to grind down the seam a little too much and then build it up again by applying more resin. This helps with replicating texture, which is easier to do if you resculpt the seam in resin versus just simply grinding or sanding the seam down and trying to replicate the texture of the clay that way. To clean up the surface of the casting, which often enough will have an air bubble or two, I use a variety of tools. For the seam, as I mentioned, I prefer a Dremel tool with a sanding drum because it's fast, but it can be a little bit aggressive, which works well when it comes to the seam because we are trying to remove a lot of material and we want to do it fast. We will be resculpting that area anyway, so subtlety doesn't really matter too much. Small air bubbles and stuff happening on the surface, however, require a bit more of a delicate hand, so we won't have to resculpt anything, or we don't really want to resculpt anything there with more resin. We just want to sand some of these imperfections down a little bit. The imperfections that I'm looking to deal with here are small positive bubbles. Negative holes or negative bubbles will obviously have to be filled, but the positive ones can simply be removed. To do this, I like to use a knife, a wood chisel, sometimes a Dremel, and just good old-fashioned sandpaper. I believe that I'm using 80 grit to remove the small bubbles and then 220 grit to smooth out the surface a bit and remove any visible scratch marks from sanding with the 80 grit. A light touch is key here as we don't want to damage the cast too much. Many of these small bubbles are tiny and requires very little attention, very little work in order to be removed. Now it can be hard to catch all of them, but I think as long as we get the majority, we'll be all good. The Dremel works well enough for this application as well, though we do need to use a very steady hand and a very light hand to not grind away too much. You can get these really nice sandpaper sanding drums for the Dremel that attach over this rubber drum. And the end result is a pretty easy to control sanding drum as the backing of the sandpaper is very soft and gives a little bit of cushioning, which means we get a little bit of room for error, let's call it. Let's thank today's sponsors, my Patreon supporters on Patreon, who have ensured the continued existence of this channel and allowed me to upgrade my gear bit by bit, making better looking and better sounding content for all of you watching. If you're interested in supporting the channel, or perhaps interested in getting personal feedback on your sculptures from me, then Patreon is the place for you. You can get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes, we can talk about armatures, supplies, mold making, or anything else you might need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out, there is a link in the description below. And again, thank you so much to those of you who have given generously and supported me. It really means the world. Once the removal of seam lines and positive air bubbles are done, we move on to resculpting any deficiencies with the same resin that we cast the piece in. And the resin that I'm using is called hydro resin. This work is going to be mostly done on the seam line, or where the seam line was. The mixed ratio of this particular hydro resin is super flexible, so in order to create a thicker batch, so I don't have to sit around and wait for it to thicken up before applying it, I simply mix in a little bit more powder than I normally would. The thickness is really up to you, but I prefer a consistency close to that of peanut butter. It'll hold texture really well, which means that once a section has been resculpted, I can move on to the next section right away. Now, if the material was a little bit more liquid, I would have to go back and chase the material, resculpting one section several times in order for it to hold the texture that I'm after. Here I don't have to do that because the material holds its shape really nicely at this viscosity. The goal is to resculpt a similar texture to the one that I did on the sculpture. This is of course very hard to do perfectly accurately. So what I've found works a bit better and is a bit easier is to oversculpt the texture of your sculpture. It's a little easier to achieve and doesn't take such a light and careful hand. The material is not exactly perfect for this application and can both stick to your tool a little bit and leave slightly strange marks as it dries out. So it's a little bit easier to take an approach that requires a little bit less finesse and can be done a little bit more aggressively. And you'll see how I deal with the oversculpted texture very soon. The tool I use for applying the resin is a small metal spatula, like one you might use for applying plaster. Now these are fairly easily available in most hardware stores. Super simple tool that works wonders for this application. The metal on the one that I use is pretty thin, and so the spatula flexes just a touch, which is super nice and allows me a little bit more control. Soft edges become a little bit easier to achieve compared to if the tool was super thick, super stiff and left a very harsh edge. There's a little bit more forgiveness in a soft tool. It's important to note that the resin sticks to this tool like crazy, or anything like crazy, to be honest. So we need to clean the tool with regular intervals, and definitely as soon as the batch of resin starts to harden, the tool needs to be cleaned. If the resin hardens on the tool, you'll need to bust out the Dremel again and sand it off. The fact that the resin sticks so well to so many materials works in our favor, however, as the fresh resin I'm applying here will stick to the surface of the resin casting, which was cast several days ago with no problem at all. Now, if we were working in plaster, we would struggle a lot more getting the fresh plaster to stick to the old plaster of the casting, as the older plaster will suck the moisture out of the fresh plaster, leaving us with powdery plaster that won't stick to the surface. There are ways around this, of course. If you are working with plaster, you can wet the old plaster, for example, by spraying lots of water on it. And if the old plaster is already saturated with moisture, then it won't draw moisture out of the fresh plaster that you'll be applying. I've seen people also leave their plaster casts in buckets of water for a little bit before reworking the seams. And that obviously wouldn't work here with such a big piece. In order to mirror the texture of my clay with the resin, I used the metal spatula tool to apply resin in a similar fashion to what I would do with the wooden clay tool. I roll the tool slightly upon application and repeat this motion and application in several different directions. I'm really not a fan when the surface of the clay has tool marks all headed in the same direction. It never looks natural or right to me, unless the tool marks follow the form in some fashion, that is. So I apply the resin in different directions and try to vary the angle I'm applying it from. This helps prevent the issue of having the tool marks very visible because of the direction that they are headed in. Towards the edge of the seam, I do my best to make sure the resin blends into the regular surface. I don't want to expand the area that I'm applying resin to too much. I want to cover the seam where I dremeled away the positive flashing and perhaps a little bit over in order to blend the old and new resin together, but I don't want to apply so much that I'm resculpting large sections. Now sometimes you do have to resculpt large sections, and that's fine, but if you don't have to, then there's no reason to do so. Let's take a quick second to talk about my Patreon page. On there, you'll find exclusive Patreon content, videos that you will only have access to if you are my supporter on Patreon. The first series we have embarked on is the Beginner's Guide to Figure Sculpture, where I cover how to sculpt a standing nude female figure in contrapposto in half-life size scale. And I cover everything from the armature, the sculpting, and eventually we'll get to the mold making as well. One video is released every month, and the video is longer than what you're used to seeing here on YouTube, at around 30 to 45 minutes long, and it's all real-time footage, no time lapses, so you get to see everything, and I'll do my best to use a very linear process with clearly defined steps, making it both easy to follow and a little bit easier to do on your own. Any patron pledging $5 or more will get access to the videos. So check out my Patreon page to watch all the videos by clicking the link in the description below. The resin takes a little while to properly set up, though it is overkill to wait as long as I wait. I do wait overnight just to make sure everything is set up properly and ready to go for the next step. For the next step of work, I need the resin to be very strong, which it really only is once it's properly set up. It can be a bit gummy for a little while and seem to set up from the outside inwards. So even if the surface of your resin is hard, the inside which you will be sanding into might not be. The last step of the process is sanding down the excess resin so the texture becomes more subtle and matches the sculpted texture a little bit better. I use a 220 grit sandpaper for this, but you could probably get away with 150 grit as well. 220 is just what I had at the time. You can run your fingers over the surface in order to feel if the texture is similar. Remember that the piece will get painted, and there will be a color difference where the sanded seam is until we get the paint on there. So color is not a good way to judge how successful you've been. You don't want to sand too much either, as the surface will start becoming glassy smooth, which will be visible once the piece is painted and finished. Leave it a touch rough to match the texture of the clay, that's present on the rest of your casting. And that's it. Pretty straightforward stuff, but it's always good for everyone to see and know that repairing seam lines or repairing casts in general is something most of us have to do. It's just a natural part of the process, so when your cast don't turn out perfect, don't despair. Just get to work. Thank you for watching, subscribe if you liked the video, stay creative, and I'll hope to see you in the next one.